For a long time, we have developed disciplines to study issues in detail. So to study nature and its phenomena, we have the natural sciences. To study society and people, we have the social sciences, and so on. However, today there is a real need for all of us as teachers to understand that while specialized knowledge is necessary to understanding anything in depth, it is very important to raise our heads from the specifics and look around and seek interconnections. Whatever we study is ultimately linked to a large number of other events, phenomena, other beings. So the sooner we understand these interconnections, the better it is. Now, if we were to apply this understanding to our topic today, the standard understanding would be that human rights are supposed to be studied by social scientists or legal experts, the environment by natural scientists, and development by economists. So we would expect that there would be some discussion on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights proposed in the United Nations in 1948, that this would be different from the other natural rights that were fought and argued for in the process of creating democracies in Europe. We would expect the different components of nature, flora, fauna, matter, materials, to be explained in their interconnection by natural scientists. And finally, development, we all know, is about the gross domestic product, national income, poverty reduction, all of which are best understood by economists. In this lecture, however, I will try to explain them differently. That is, I will trace the concepts historically and show how all of these are modern concepts, even though the ideas underlying them would be very old. By the very manner in which we have defined them, it will be clear that in fact, each of them transforms our understanding of human beings and the world in which they live, and that this has been done in recent times. Once we get that understood, then we will be able to see the relationship between human rights, environment and development very clearly as well, and not as standalone issues to be studied only by different disciplines. I also plan to change the order in which we will discuss them. So we've been given human rights, environment, development, but I will begin with development, then environment, then that will be followed by a discussion on human rights. Why I am doing this will become clear towards the end of the lecture. The idea of human progress, where human beings have tried hard to lead better lives through better technology, etc., is old. But using technology to maximize the utilization of natural resources for human beings, for the benefit of human beings, that is development, is a relatively new idea, one that belongs to the modern period of history. So development is a modern idea. It is based on a tremendous idea of human achievement, no doubt, by which every human being should be able to live a good life because they have the reason and intelligence to do so. Prior to the modern period, it was assumed that the good life would only be available to a privileged few. But the idea of democracy, which evolves along with the idea of development, encourages the idea of prosperity for all. By itself, this is a very attractive idea, and any comfort or well-being needs to be the aspiration for everyone. There's no question about that. So development was seen to be the route by which true equality and democracy would be achieved. Everyone would have the right to live a better life. Nearly 300 or more years after the onset of the Industrial Revolution, on which this idea of development was based, however, serious flaws in this concept are very visible. The first flaw is that it requires a much higher scale of appropriation of nature than has ever been the case in human history. It comes from looking upon nature as a series of resources available to serve human interest, purpose and ambition, and waiting to be conquered. Given that development, the idea of development, necessarily replicates this idea wherever it goes, it has become a part and parcel of the human imagination worldwide, because development is something that everyone has learned to want across the globe in the last 70 years or so, since the end of the Second World War particularly. Now, this is in direct contrast to the earlier notions of humans and nature cohabiting the earth, and therefore some deference to nature's cycles and sanctity that limited human reach. And 70 years on, after the concept of development has caught on, we realize that while nature is abundant and bountiful, besides which modern science enables us to make it even more so, we have reached a limit we should not cross if we are to survive as a species on this planet. Also, we've realized that a large number of byproducts of human initiative and endeavor are actually harmful for nature, not fitting into its cycle of decay and regeneration. This has happened because we did not consider this before, and now we are struggling to create technologies that have the capacity to do so. Now, this is a well-known and well-understood flaw of development. Another less recognized aspect of development, which is crucial to its understanding on its own and in relation to other concepts of concern to us in today's lecture, is the larger structure of the historical relations in which it evolved. So I'm trying to now understand an aspect of development which is a crucial flaw historically established. We all know that development began in Europe through the Industrial Revolution. Now we need to remember, so this is the modern idea of development. Now we need to remember that this was after the Europeans had traveled across the world buying sophisticated finished goods from places like India, China and Latin America, and accumulated capital as a result, because those were the advanced countries of that time. When the Europeans accumulated this capital, they used that capital to develop their own technologies into successful industry, and they had the Industrial Revolution. That is what we call the Industrial Revolution. Now, the completion of the success of this revolution rested, however, on their ability to sell their manufactured goods to markets outside of their own small ones, because Europe is a very small part of the world. And only that would generate the necessary capital for it to grow further. So, this problem was solved by the Europeans by colonization of the rest of the world in order to create captive markets. Huge empires were set up across the globe by relatively very small countries. The empire performed a very crucial function, several crucial functions actually, of moving labor to work on cash crop plantations, to acquire primary goods as source material for industry at cheap rates from the colonies to Europe, and later to also move finance capital out of Europe to be invested in newly emerging centers of industry elsewhere. Now, these trends continued well after the decolonization process after the Second World War and the apparent loss of empires. Because this process continued, because it is imperialism and colonialism that created the structure and character of the modern international economy. And it was around this that the modern international financial and political institutions were created. And this structure of the international political economy is what has sustained the development that was already created in the 19th and 20th century into the 21st. And it is in that context that all the post-colonial nations and newly emerging nations, or the developing nations, whatever you may call them, they have to operate in that. Now, this is shown to be a natural order of things. Actually, it was a reflection of the hegemonic power structure of that time. And to a large extent, this remains as such, the hegemonic power structure. So the result is that development remains the achievement of some parts of the world, while others are continuously struggling to achieve it. So by this discussion, we are able to establish that the modern idea of development has shown the way for prosperity and well-being in ways that are very attractive, but both scientifically and structurally a mirage for most of the world. In a sense then, the environment with a capital E is a product of this process called development with a capital D. Let me explain how this happens. Notice how the flora, fauna, air, water, layers of the earth, mountains, seas, etc. were referred to as nature up until the 1970s even. They have been our source of sustenance for millennia. As I said before, human beings have cleared forests, diverted water sources, grown crops, made roads, created different modes of transport over land and sea, all for a very long time. This process is what we have called the evolution of human civilization. So our ability to use nature has grown by leaps and bounds over evolution and enabled our creativity such that we have transformed our planet to a globe. Now, what is significant over the last 300 years or so, we have used nature more than tenfold in this period than we have in all of human existence before it. We've quickened the pace and we've broadened the base of its usage manifold, and such that we are being actually able to visualize the impact we are having on all aspects of nature that we've listed so far. Also, there's hardly any aspect of nature left which we are not affecting in some way or the other. This was most eloquently and famously articulated in the 1960s by Rachel Carson's well-known book Silent Spring, in which she argued that our continued use of pesticides and other chemicals, which we believe is for higher and better human interests, would eventually deprive elements of nature that we do not recognize to be crucial to us. It is this recognition that posits the whole of nature vis-a-vis a comprehensive set of interventions with respect to it. That is, the environment is pitched against development. One of the best explanations of human impact on nature has been offered by the wonderful team of a historian of nature and a scientist, a biologist. They are Ramchandra Guha and Madhav Gadgil. They show how in the last 300 to 500 years the use of nature has become hardly different from the abuse of nature. Even more importantly, they show that not all people abuse nature. They innovatively divide people into omnivores, ecosystem people, and ecological refugees. Three broad categories to which we might assign all of India's population, perhaps even the population of the world. These three classes might be distinguished by the size of their respective resource catchments or by their relative ability to transform nature into artifacts. This means that each of them have different access to resources, also have different capacities to transform nature into products from which they can make profits. So, the omnivores, as the name suggests or implies, are those that have substantial power to access over natural resources, which they use directly for consumption and also for making other things. Ecosystem people are those that live on nature. They eke out a living from nature, and often they are governed by cultural norms of restraint with respect to these resources. Ecological refugees are those that have been taken out of their natural environment to those that they are not familiar with. As a result, they do not have the knowledge and skills to eke out a living in the new context and are reduced to deprivation and poverty. Now, two kinds of understanding emerge from this classification, one economic and the other political. Omnivores Omnivores have power, and so they decide not only what they will get, but also what the others will do and get. They make decisions about natural resources that will be used in general, and so take decisions for the lives of ecosystem people, and could even make them into ecological refugees. Because most omnivores do not have much idea of the knowledge base of ecological refugees, they are so removed from them. They have no idea about their knowledge or their skill sets. They are only able to see them as poor and deprived and treat them with pity and disdain rather than with intelligence and empathy. So they are not able to utilize them as effective human resources, but they wield control over them. At the same time, other problems emerge. Gadgil and Guha argue that, and I quote, like all attempts to classify and interpret complex phenomena, this one too would run into the inevitable boundaries problems. So, for example, is a village school teacher with an assured salary from the state exchequer and perhaps some land an ecosystem people, or is he a rural omnivore? The owner of a small garage in the city lacks the social power to classify as an authentic omnivore, but can hardly be called an ecological refugee either. These examples could be multiplied, but while recognizing this difficulty, we are nevertheless convinced that a majority of the Indian population is covered by the three categories identified by us. Close quotes. So this brings us to the final concept of our lecture today, that of human rights. One thing we all understand, human rights are our natural rights as human beings plus something more. This latter plus is added on by our modern sense of human beings as an individual, has the capacity to think independently, rationally, and is driven by doing what he or she considers to be their own good, and can also think of the larger common good once his own is taken care of. Yet, if we are to understand human rights today and after this discussion that we've done before, it would be impossible to understand it outside of the context of development and the environment, because these are the abiding contexts in which people's lives are built. So, it would be appropriate to say that human rights are defined by the location of people in these three categories which we've discussed so far. Omnivores are most likely to be able to access their human rights, the ecosystem people a little less than them, and ecological refugees whose very existence is defined by their marginalization and exclusion not very much at all. Yet, while this might define a great deal of the reality, it is very important to remember that reality is much more complex than that. Not all those who are born into the category of omnivores would be in agreement with the benefits of the power structure that they themselves can access. And they would question it, they would work towards alternatives that are much more equitable and just. Similarly, not all ecological refugees are cowed down by their situation. They would wage movements to alter their situation, in the process of which they might align with like-minded omnivores actually, and ecosystem people. So what they are capable of doing is to be guided by their reason and their sense of justice, and the human history of struggle and challenge has shown that the thirst for equality and fairness equals, if not goes way beyond, the human tendency towards avarice and greed for power or for profit. So by way of conclusion, therefore, we would say that it is the awareness of the interconnectedness of the issues of human rights, environment and development that provide the best avenues of creativity for an understanding of the human being in harmony with nature, and also maintaining harmony between human beings.